The glass doors of the downtown museum swung open, the echo of footsteps swallowed by the cavernous lobby. Jamal Harris adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, eyes flicking to the new exhibit banner. The history of racism in America. A quiet pride swelled. He had spent years curating this collection, every photograph, every archival note meticulously chosen. "Sir," a sharp voice cut to the hum of tourists. Jamal froze. A uniformed officer, broad-shouldered and flushed with impatience, stepped forward. "You're not allowed to be, loitering." Jamal blinked. "Loitering? I work here. I curated this exhibit." The officer's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing. "Not buying it. ID." The click of metal against metal, the shuffle of papers, the low murmur of bystanders. It all blurred. Jamal's heart hammered. He handed over his ID, his badge of authority feeling suddenly meaningless in this man's grip. "Looks like someone's up to something," the officer muttered under his breath. His gaze lingered too long, heavy with suspicion, dismissive of Jamal's protests. Jamal's palms were slick against the laminated ID. I'm telling you I'm the curator. You can call the front desk." "Don't waste my time," the officer snapped, voice rising. "You don't belong here." A visitor gasped. Cameras clicked. The lobby's light seemed to shrink, walls closing in. Jamal's stomach sank. The weight of assumption, history, prejudice, a million untold stories pressing down. The officer stepped closer, hand hovering near his belt. Jamal swallowed. His voice caught. "You're making a mistake," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The officer smirked, eyes cold. "We'll see about that." And then the security cameras caught it all. Jamal realized he was trapped, not by bars, but by ignorance, power, and a system that had already judged him. The glass doors of the downtown museum swung open, letting in the chill December air. Jamal Harris adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, the worn leather creaking under the weight of notebooks, photographs, and his meticulously organized exhibit notes. The history of racism in America. A swell of pride rose in his chest. Months of research, weeks of coordinating loans from archives, and endless late nights had culminated in this space. Every photograph, every placard, every historical artifact reflected a truth many would rather ignore, but Jamal wanted them to see it, to feel it. He was halfway across the lobby when a sharp, clipped voice cut through the low hum of the morning crowd. "Sir." Jamal froze. His eyes scanned the room. Tourists moved casually past him, phones held high to capture abstract sculptures and historical displays, oblivious. But the voice came again, closer, more insistent. "Sir, you're not allowed to be, loitering." Jamal turned slowly. The officer was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered, uniform pressed, starched, and perfectly polished. He stood too close, like an obstacle Jamal couldn't step around. His eyes were narrow, calculating. "I loitering?" Jamal said carefully, hands lifting in a gesture of reason. "I work here. I curated this exhibit. I'm ID." The officer barked, cut him off. The word felt like a hammer to Jamal's chest. His throat tightened. He reached into his bag and pulled out his laminated curator badge, the official ID clipped to his jacket. The officer's eyes flicked at it, then back to Jamal, disbelief like a tangible weight pressing down. "You don't belong here," the officer muttered under his breath, but loud enough for the nearest visitors to catch. Jamal swallowed hard. His palms were slick, his heart beat a frantic drum. I'm telling you I'm the curator. You can call the front desk, verify my identity. Please, I have a duty to—" "Don't waste my time," the officer interrupted, stepping closer. The leather of his belt gleamed under museum lights, and Jamal noticed a subtle shift of his hand near the holster. His voice hardened. "We've had complaints. Suspicious behavior. We need to take precautions." The words were simple, bureaucratic, but every syllable dripped with accusation. Jamal's stomach sank. Suspicious behavior. He had read about this phrase, heard in news reports, whispered in conversation. Code for someone other, someone to be feared. And here it was, pointed directly at him in the most visible, public way possible. I'm not suspicious, Jamal said, trying to keep his voice steady. He gestured toward the exhibit banner behind him. I curated this exhibit. I've spent years on this research. I am the one who selected every item you see here. Every photo, every document. Hands where I can see them, the officer snapped. A group of tourists froze mid-step, eyes wide. Phones came out. Jamal's own hands rose slowly, almost instinctively, trembling. The cold of the morning and the sterile museum lights did nothing to calm the fire of panic rising in his chest. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? Jamal asked, his voice quiet but firm, the weight of disbelief pressing in. I am the curator. Save it. The officer cut in sharply. His smirk was subtle, cruel, the kind that comes from authority unchecked. You don't have to explain anything to me. Just follow instructions. Jamal's eyes flicked around the lobby. Museum staff hovered nearby, uncertain. A security guard, young and nervous, shifted from foot to foot, glancing at the officer, then at Jamal, clearly torn. Visitors whispered, pointed discreetly, some capturing the moment on their phones. Jamal's stomach twisted. It wasn't just humiliation. It was disbelief, the kind that felt like being erased in plain sight. I'm not resisting, Jamal said softly. Try and keep control. I'm telling you the truth. You can call the front desk. You can check the security footage. You will see I am telling the truth. The officer leaned slightly forward, voice low but menacing. We'll see about that. He reached for Jamal's arm. The sudden physicality made Jamal flinch. His breath caught. The hum of the lobby seemed to vanish. All he could hear was the soft clicking of shoes on marble floors, the low murmur of observers, the subtle squeak of his bag shifting under his weight. Please, Jamal whispered. You don't understand. This is my work, my life. I understand perfectly, the officer said, his tone almost conversational, as if he had been explaining this to a colleague. I'm just doing my job. Jamal's mouth went dry. He wanted to shout, to argue, to point his badge at the banner, at the security cameras that surely had already begun recording this interaction. But words failed him. His fear was a solid presence, pressing his chest, making his limbs heavy. The officer signaled subtly toward the lobby exit. Step over here. Now. Jamal hesitated. Every instinct screamed against compliance, but the officer's body, his presence, the authority he wielded, it was suffocating. Slowly, cautiously, Jamal moved toward the officer, aware of the eyes on him, aware that his reputation, his dignity, and his very identity were on display in a public space meant for learning, not humiliation. As he moved, a young woman from the crowd whispered, barely audible, "Why is he doing this?" Jamal's stomach twisted. He looked at the officer, who met his gaze with thinly veiled irritation, then at the camera above, and finally back to the crowd, frozen witnesses capturing every micro-expression. The surreal theater of power and prejudice closed in. "Sir," the officer said again, voice clipped and cold. "Step aside and keep quiet." Jamal's hands shook. He realized with a sickening clarity that no amount of explanation would matter. This wasn't about evidence. It wasn't about truth. It was about control, about authority unchallenged, about a system ready to judge him before he could even speak. "You're making a mistake," Jamal said softly, more to himself than anyone else. The officer smirked, a small twist of lips that carried arrogance and disdain. "We'll see about that." The lobby lights glinted off the officer's badge. The security cameras silently rotated, capturing the confrontation. Jamal felt the weight of history pressing down, centuries of injustice, coded prejudice, assumptions of criminality, assumptions of guilt. He realized that in this moment, he was not just defending himself. He was defending every name, every story, every person erased before their time. And yet, he knew he was alone. The officer stepped closer, hand hovering near his belt. Jamal's heart pounded against his ribs. The murmurs of the crowd became a low drone in his ears. His mind raced, searching for the words, the proof, the escape. The museum, the sanctuary of knowledge he'd built, had become a stage for power wielded recklessly. A click from the officer's holster made Jamal flinch. Cameras flashed in the distance, and a voice somewhere behind him muttered, "This is insane." Jamal's chest tightened. He took a shallow breath. He needed to hold himself together. He needed to survive this moment. He needed someone, anyone, to see the truth. But as the officer's smirk widened, Jamal understood the terrifying reality. He was not just facing one man's prejudice. He was standing against centuries of systemic bias, public perception, and unquestioned authority. The officer's hand shifted slightly. The back office smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, the kind of sterile smell that made Jamal's stomach churn. Officer Dalton sat across from him, rigid in his chair, eyes narrowed, arms crossed like a barricade. The fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied, casting a cold glare over the room. Jamal's hands fidgeted on a laminated ID card he had clutched like a lifeline all morning. "I'm telling you," Jamal said, voice firm despite the tension. "I curate the History of Racism exhibit. Every piece in that gallery reflects months, years of research. You've made a mistake." Dalton's smirk didn't waver. "I've made plenty of mistakes, sure," he said casually, leaning back. "But this isn't one of them. People like you tend to attract attention." Jamal's stomach dropped. "People like me." The phrase had been whispered, murmured, and assumed 1,000 times before, but spoken aloud it felt like a slap. He clenched his fists. "Attention for what?" Jamal asked, tone rising. "For showing history? For educating the public?" Dalton shrugged, dismissive. "You know what I mean. Suspicious behavior. Staying too long in one area. Wearing a hoodie indoors." Jamal froze. Hoodie indoors. He was wearing a simple black jacket over a sweater. Nothing provocative. Nothing suspicious. But Dalton's eyes said differently. The officer's assumptions were heavier than facts, sharper than any badge. "I have every right to be there," Jamal said, his voice shaking slightly despite himself. "I'm the curator. Staff can verify me. Witnesses saw me. Security footage shows me moving through the exhibit." Dalton cut him off. "I don't care what footage shows. I act on what I see and what I hear. You're the one causing complaints." A bead of sweat slid down Jamal's temple. He wanted to scream, to shake Dalton, to demand reason, but he knew it would accomplish nothing. Power was stacked against him, and Dalton wielded it like a weapon. "Complaint from whom?" Jamal asked, leaning forward, desperate. "Staff? Visitors?" Dalton tapped his fingers on the table. Slow, deliberate, anonymously. "Doesn't matter. Point is, someone thought you looked out of place, and I tend to those situations." Out of place. Jamal's chest tightened. Each word cut deeper than the last. He had dedicated his life to documenting how systemic injustice functioned. Yet here it was, manifest in real time, codified in protocol, reinforced by an unthinking badge. "I'm not a threat," Jamal said softly, almost to himself. "I'm a curator. I am a witness to history, not a criminal." Dalton leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're telling me what you are doesn't matter? You think a badge on a wall or a fancy title protects you? Not in my city. Not in my jurisdiction." Jamal's mind raced. If this escalated, if Dalton called for backup or filed a formal complaint, he could be suspended, arrested, or worse. All because of a uniformed man's assumptions. He tried to control his breathing, count syllables, hold on to dignity. "Call the front desk," Jamal said again. "Ask anyone. They'll confirm I'm the curator." Dalton shook his head. "No need. I've made my decision. You'll stay here until I determine what to do." Jamal's stomach dropped. Stay here? Was he being detained? Without charges? Without cause? He glanced around the room. The walls seemed to shrink, fluorescent light harsh and accusatory. The office chair under him felt thin, fragile, like it might break under the weight of injustice. A faint buzz came from the hallway, someone clearing their throat. Jamal's eyes flicked to the small glass window on the door. A museum security guard, pale and hesitant, waved a sheet of paper toward Dalton. Officer Dalton," the guard said, voice quivering. "These are the visitor logs. You can see Mr. Harris's entries." Dalton barely glanced at the paper, then set it aside. Logs don't matter. I trust what I see. Jamal's lips pressed into a thin line. Trust what you see, not the truth. He wanted to speak, to argue, to demand reason, but the weight of authority pinned him in place. You're wasting time, Dalton said finally, leaning back. People like you should know their place. Jamal's chest tightened. His hands shook, not with fear, but with rage. People like me? I've spent my life documenting injustice, educating people, preserving history. And you? Dalton raised a hand, silencing him. I don't need lectures. You need compliance. The words echoed in the office. Comply. Obey. Silence. Jamal felt the press of centuries of similar encounters, the assumption of guilt, the presumption of criminality, the belief that his skin, his appearance, his very presence was inherently suspect. He looked to the security guard again. Please, he said quietly. Someone check the footage. Someone verify me. The guard swallowed nervously. I can, but what? Jamal asked sharply. I don't want trouble, the guard admitted, voice barely audible. Jamal closed his eyes for a moment. Even in a place dedicated to knowledge and truth, people were afraid. Afraid of power, afraid of authority, afraid of standing up to a uniformed officer. Dalton smirked, watching the exchange like a predator observing prey. See? Fear is natural. You should be careful pushing back. Jamal's jaw tightened. He wanted to retort, to scream at the injustice, to expose the arrogance, but he forced himself to breathe, to strategize, to survive. There had to be a way to turn this around. Minutes stretched. The fluorescent lights hummed. Dalton's eyes never left him. Each tick of the clock felt like a second borrowed from his life, from his dignity. Then a faint sound from the hallway, a phone vibrating, a staff member stepping closer, broke the monotony. Dalton glanced at the door, annoyance flickering across his face. I'll need a formal report, Dalton said suddenly, standing. And you'll remain here until it's complete. Don't think about moving. Jamal's stomach twisted. Formal report. This wasn't about evidence or truth or facts. It was about a narrative Dalton would write, a story where Jamal's voice was secondary, where assumption carried more weight than reality. Yes, sir, Jamal said, the words bitter on his tongue. He realized that arguing now would only escalate the situation. Compliance was the only option, but he vowed silently that this would not end here. Someone would see the truth. Someone would bear witness. Dalton left the office briefly, probably make a call or dictate his version of events. The room seemed to shrink in his absence. Jamal pressed his hands together, whispering under his breath, I will not be erased. The words were small, but fierce. They carried the weight of generations, of every time someone like him had been doubted, dismissed, or devalued. They carried the promise of resistance, of persistence, of truth surviving even under the harshest scrutiny. And in that sterile, fluorescent-lit office, Jamal understood that the battle had only begun. Outside, the hum of the museum continued, oblivious. The crowd wandered through exhibits, pointing at photographs, reading placards, taking selfies. They didn't know the storm brewing behind a locked office door. They couldn't see the injustice, the abuse of power, the thin line between authority and oppression. But Jamal knew, and he was ready to fight. The fluorescent lights of the interrogation room buzzed overhead, washing the walls in cold, unyielding white. Jamal Harris sat on a hard metal chair, legs crossed at the ankles, wrists folded in his lap, eyes darting between the door and the officer's clipboard. The sterile smell of disinfectant mingled with a faint tang of old coffee and dust, and Jamal's stomach churned as if the air itself carried judgment. Officer Richard Dalton leaned back in his chair across from him, arms crossed, the same smirk lingering on his face that had haunted Jamal all morning. So, Dalton said slowly, tapping the clipboard with a pen, we have your version. Now, let's see what the evidence says. Jamal swallowed hard. Everything in the museum backs me up. Security footage, visitor logs, staff verification. You can check with anyone. Dalton cut him off. I don't care what anyone says. Evidence is subjective. People see what they expect to see. I saw suspicious behavior. That's what counts. Jamal's chest tightened. Suspicious behavior. Again the phrase. An invisible noose tightening around him, built from assumption and prejudice rather than facts. He clenched his fists under the table. "Officer," he said evenly, "I've been working at the museum for years. I curated the history of racism exhibit. Every photo, every artifact, every note, you can verify all of it. I'm not lying. I'm not resisting. I am telling the truth. Check the logs. Check the cameras. You will see." Dalton waved a hand dismissively. "Logs and cameras don't matter. What matters is that someone looks suspicious. You fit the profile. People like you." Jamal flinched at the words. "People like me." How many times had he heard that, in whispers, in sideways glances, in the cold calculation of assumed guilt? Too many. And now it came from a man with authority. Someone with the power to make decisions that could destroy his life in minutes. A faint knock on the door made both men turn. A young female officer stepped in, holding a tablet. "Sir, we've reviewed the museum footage. The staff confirmed Mr. Harris's identity. He is the curator of the exhibit." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "Confirmed by who?" "By the museum staff and security," she replied. Her tone was polite, but there was a subtle hesitation, as if she, too, felt the weight of the situation. Dalton leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Staff confirmation doesn't make you any less suspicious. Anyone could claim anything. I rely on instinct, on observation." Jamal felt his throat tighten. His hands, resting lightly on the table, began to shake. "Observation? You observed me walking through the lobby, doing my job, being myself, and somehow that makes me suspicious." Dalton's smirk widened. "It's not about what you do. It's about what you represent. People see patterns. I see patterns." Jamal swallowed hard. Every syllable from Dalton was a reminder that prejudice could masquerade as authority, that assumptions could outweigh evidence, and that his identity could be criminalized simply because it made someone uncomfortable. "I'm not a pattern," Jamal said, voice low but steady. "I'm a human being. I'm a historian. I am the person who tells the stories that others might want to hide." Dalton leaned back, smirking again. "Stories don't matter. Compliance matters. Order matters. You crossed the line this morning. You should know your place." Jamal's jaw clenched. He felt a familiar mix of rage and disbelief, the sickening understanding that logic and truth were meaningless to those who wielded unchecked power. He looked down at the laminated Curator badge on the table, the little rectangle of authority that held no weight in Dalton's eyes. "Then what happens now?" Jamal asked quietly. "Am I being detained? Charged? I need to know what you intend to do, because I have a reputation, a career, a responsibility to this museum and this city." Dalton shrugged. "We'll see. For now, I need a formal statement. You'll write it down. Every detail. Every word you've said to me today. And don't leave anything out. Omissions can be complicated." Jamal exhaled sharply, realizing the subtle threat buried in Dalton's words. Omit a detail, no matter how trivial, and the officer could twist it, turn it into proof of guilt, suspicion, or obstruction. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. A sound from the hallway, a door creaking open, made Jamal flinch. Another officer stepped in, carrying a folder filled with printed visitor logs and security footage screenshots. "Sir, the logs, the footage." Dalton waved the new officer away, dismissive. "We don't need this right now. I'll review it later. Mr. Harris, focus on your statement." Jamal's stomach turned. Later, his life, his work, his dignity, now depended on a man who had already made up his mind. He looked down at the blank sheet in front of him, pen hovering over paper, trying to steady his hands. He began writing, carefully choosing words, documenting events as accurately as possible, knowing that any misstep could be used against him. The officer's eyes never left him, sharp and calculating, a constant reminder of the imbalance of power. As he wrote, Dalton's voice broke the tense silence. "You know, this could be easier if you just admitted to being out of line. Save yourself some trouble." Jamal froze. "Out of line? I did nothing wrong. I curated an exhibit. I worked. I walked through a lobby. That's not out of line. Dalton leaned forward. Out of line in my jurisdiction. Out of line in my eyes. You should understand that. Jamal's hands tightened around the pen. Every instinct screamed that this was absurd, that this was injustice in its rawest form. And yet, he knew arguing further might provoke Dalton, might escalate the situation to a place where legality and authority would conspire against him. Minutes ticked by. Jamal's pen scratched furiously across the paper. He documented every word, every motion, every interaction from the museum lobby, careful to remain factual, concise, and calm. Each sentence was an act of resistance, a refusal to let prejudice erase the truth. Dalton watched silently, occasionally muttering notes on his clipboard, eyes flicking between Jamal's face and the pen in his hand. Jamal felt every gaze as an accusation, every smirk as a judgment. And yet, beneath it all, a small ember of defiance glowed. He paused, looking up. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly. "It's about history, about truth, about every time someone like me has been judged before they could speak. You can't erase that." Dalton's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable. "Maybe not, but I can control what happens in this room." Jamal nodded slightly, accepting the reality. Control here did not mean justice. Authority here did not mean morality. But truth still existed, silent, patient, and waiting to be acknowledged. Finally, Dalton stepped back. "Good. Finish your statement. We'll see where this goes next." Jamal exhaled, the tension in his shoulders loosening slightly, though his mind raced. He had survived the immediate confrontation, documented the evidence, and maintained composure under scrutiny. But the battle was far from over. Every interaction, every assumption, every biased glance outside that room threatened his reputation, his career, and his dignity. As Dalton left the room briefly, Jamal stared at the blank spaces yet to be filled on his statement. His pen hovered over the paper, and he whispered under his breath. Jamal sat at his small apartment desk that evening, the city lights flickering through the blinds like a grid of judgmental eyes. The events at the museum replayed in his mind. The officer's smirk, the dismissive words, the weight of assumption pressing down like a vice. His hands trembled slightly, still slick from the confrontation. He pushed the pen across the paper, tracing the outline of the day's statement. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He picked up his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the name he needed. Marissa Lane, civil rights attorney. Fierce, smart, unafraid. "Marissa," he said when she answered, voice tight but controlled. "Jamal, what happened?" Her tone was immediate, sharp, concerned. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "I was stopped at the museum by a police officer. He claimed I was loitering. Suspicious. He didn't believe I was the curator of the exhibit I organized. Security confirmed it. Staff confirmed it. Cameras confirmed it. But he didn't care. He detained me for questioning, demanded a statement." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then Marissa's voice came firm. "I'm on my way. Don't move anything. Don't make any calls without me. I want all records, footage, statements, everything. This ends today, Jamal." Her confidence was a bomb. Jamal felt a spark of hope mixed with lingering fear. "Okay, thank you. I can't believe this is happening. I've curated the exhibit to expose history, injustice, racism, and yet here I am judged before anyone even listens." "Exactly why this matters," Marissa said, her tone softening. "You're the curator, the authority, the witness. And he assumes everything about me." Jamal's voice cracked slightly. "And the world just lets him." Marissa's tone hardened. "Not today. I'll be there in 30. Prepare everything for me. Visitor logs, footage, staff statements, your ID, your badge. Every scrap. We're going to document this. Every word, every gesture, every biased action. If the law won't stop him, the public will." Jamal nodded to himself. Even though she couldn't see him, he felt the first flicker of resolve. Resistance, he realized, was not just a legal strategy. It was a moral necessity. 30 minutes later, Marissa Lane stepped into the apartment, carrying a sleek briefcase and an air of authority that filled the room. Her eyes scanned Jamal, taking his tension, his fatigue, and the resolve that lingered beneath. "Show me everything," she said. Jamal spread the documents across the small desk. Screenshots of museum footage, visitor logs, ID verification, even transcripts of staff statements. Marissa leaned over, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. "This is good," she said. "Every piece is concrete. You have more than enough to challenge this." And the officer? He overstepped. Way overstepped. "This isn't about your behavior. It's about his assumptions." Jamal rubbed his forehead. "Assumptions wielded like weapons. That's what terrifies me. He didn't even consider the evidence. Didn't even pause to verify me. He acted on prejudice." Marissa's expression hardened. "That's systemic bias, Jamal. And it's why we document, why we resist, why we make sure the world sees it. This is more than one officer. It's the institution protecting its own assumptions. But we can fight it." Jamal exhaled slowly, letting her words sink in. "And the museum? They'll have to cooperate," Marissa said firmly. "They can't hide evidence, can't claim ignorance. Staff statements, footage, visitor logs, they're all part of your defense. And your exposure to the exhibit's value makes it harder for them to dismiss this as trivial." He nodded again. "I want to expose this, not just for me, for everyone who's been judged, silenced, erased before they could speak." Marissa's voice softened. "And you will, but carefully, strategically. We document, we challenge, we force accountability. That's resistance." Jamal felt a steady determination building in his chest, a fire he hadn't felt since the first time he realized the power of history, of truth, of witness. "Where do we start?" "Step one," Marissa said, "is a formal complaint. Internal affairs, museum administration. Step two is documentation. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every discrepancy in the officer's claims. Step three is public pressure. If necessary, we create a record that cannot be ignored. And step four is justice." Jamal looked at her, feeling the gravity of the plan, and yet the pulse of hope that her words carried. "Justice," he repeated softly, tasting the word. "It feels possible when you're here." Marissa smirked faintly. "I don't make things possible. I make them inevitable. And Jamal, don't underestimate the power of a well-documented truth." The hours passed. They worked through the museum footage frame by frame, verifying timestamps, cross-referencing staff statements, noting every subtle microaggression Dalton had committed. Marissa's pen moved swiftly across her notebook, writing strategy, documenting evidence, mapping out next steps. Jamal copied down notes, keeping a personal record, his hands steady now despite the earlier tension. Finally, they leaned back, a quiet pause settling over the apartment. The city lights blinked through the blinds, distant and indifferent. "You're ready," Marissa said. "You have the evidence, you have the statements, you have the documentation. If the officer thinks he can act with impunity, he's about to be proven wrong." Jamal exhaled. "It still feels surreal that I'm defending myself against someone who assumes so much, so easily." "That's reality," Marissa said. "Bias doesn't require justification, but truth requires effort, and you're prepared." He nodded, feeling the weight of the day, the tension, the humiliation, but also a growing sense of control, of agency. He wasn't powerless. He wasn't alone. "Tomorrow," Marissa said, "we begin the official process. Internal affairs, museum administration, and if needed, public attention. But tonight, we rest, we prepare, and we plan. Resistance is patient, Jamal. It doesn't rely on anger. It relies on strategy." Jamal leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes for a brief moment. He let himself feel the exhaustion, the fear, the lingering sting of Dalton's assumptions. But he also let himself feel the ember of determination, now stoked into a small flame by Marissa's presence and guidance. "Patient, strategic resistance," he murmured. "I can do that." Outside, the city continued its rhythm. Cars honking, distant laughter, lights flickering, unaware of the quiet revolution forming in a small apartment above downtown streets. Inside, Jamal Harris was plotting his next move, the curator who refused to be erased, and the lawyer who would make sure his story, his truth, was heard. As the night stretched on, Jamal stared at the photographs of the exhibit pinned to his wall. The faces of those who had suffered, resisted, survived. Each image was a reminder of the stakes, a motivation for fight ahead. Dalton's assumptions were powerful, but Jamal's truth was stronger. And now, with Marissa's guidance, it would be seen. In that quiet room, Jamal Harris understood something fundamental. Resistance wasn't just legal. It was moral. It was personal. It was necessary. And he would not back down. By mid-morning, the story had already begun its slow ripple through the city. Jamal Harris sat in a small conference room at the museum, the glow of his laptop reflecting off his glasses. Marissa Lane was beside him, reviewing statements and footage one last time before submitting the formal complaint to Internal Affairs. Outside, the lobby hummed with tourists, oblivious of the storm brewing within the museum's administration. "I've uploaded everything," Marissa said firmly, her fingers tapping the last few keys on the keyboard. Logs, footage, staff statements, visitor accounts. Every biased comment Dalton made, every assumption he acted on, it's all here. Nothing can be ignored. Jamal exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe it's come to this. That a single officer's prejudice can ripple so far, affect so many people, and yet so few notice." "Most don't notice," Marissa said. "But when the media catches it, the public can't look away. That's when accountability becomes inevitable." Jamal's stomach twisted. He hated the idea of public exposure, the scrutiny, the risk of misrepresentation. But Marissa was right. Dalton's assumptions weren't just personal. They were institutional. They thrived on invisibility. And visibility was now his greatest weapon. 2 hours later, a local news station ran a short segment. Curator detained at museum under suspicion, officers' actions questioned. The clip showed a blurred image of Jamal's ID. The officers clipped instructions and a few panicked whispers from visitors. Social media exploded. Hashtags advocating justice for Jamal trended within hours. Jamal watched the clip in stunned silence. His pride in the exhibit clashed with his horror at being publicly humiliated. Every comment, every retweet, every post weighed heavily, but also carried an undeniable truth. The world was finally watching. "Look at this," Marissa said, pointing to the growing thread of supportive messages online. "People are paying attention. They're noticing the pattern, not just the isolated incident. This is what we need." Jamal nodded slowly. The tension in his chest eased slightly, replaced by a cautious optimism. Yet he couldn't shake the gnawing anxiety, Dalton's arrogance, the museum's internal politics, the potential for backlash. The museum administration summoned him and Marissa for a meeting. The large conference room felt oppressive, the polish reflecting authority and expectation. Several administrators sat across from them, folding arms, adjusting ties, and flipping through Jamal's submitted evidence. "Mr. Harris," the museum director began, voice calm but distant, "we've reviewed your complaint. The situation with Officer Dalton has caused considerable attention." "Yes," Jamal said, meeting the director's gaze steadily. "And it should. His actions weren't just improper. They were prejudiced. I was doing my job. I was in the museum I manage. And yet, my identity, my authority, my work were dismissed because of assumptions about who I am." The director nodded slowly. "We understand your perspective, but we must also consider protocol, public relations, and law enforcement relations." Jamal felt a familiar frustration tighten in his chest. Protocol doesn't justify prejudice. Authority doesn't excuse assumption. And public relations cannot erase humiliation or bias. Marissa leaned forward. "This isn't just about procedure. It's about systemic accountability. The officer acted on assumption. That assumption is rooted in racial bias. The institution cannot ignore it without complicit silence." A murmur passed across the administrators. The director's expression hardened slightly. "We will cooperate fully with the internal affairs investigation, but we must also manage the museum's reputation." Jamal pressed his lips together. He understood the delicate dance between justice and optics, but his priority was clear: truth, evidence, and accountability. Later that afternoon, Jamal returned to the exhibit. He walked slowly between the glass cases, touching nothing, letting his fingers hover near the placards. The images, photographs of protests, newspaper clippings, portraits of activists, reminded him why he had dedicated his life to this work. He paused in front of a photograph of a sit-in from the 1960s. The faces young, defiant, hopeful. He realized that his own experience was just another chapter in the long history he curated. The history of being judged, silenced, and assumed guilty without cause. Yet, unlike those captured in photographs, he had a voice, witnesses, and allies. A museum staff member approached cautiously. "Mr. Harris, people are asking about you on social media. News outlets are calling." Jamal nodded. "I know. I've seen it. But the focus needs to remain on the facts, on what happened, not just on me." The staff member hesitated. "Are you okay?" Jamal smiled faintly. "I will be. This exhibit isn't just history. It's a lesson. And today we are part of that lesson." That evening, Jamal watched as the news segment repeated on several channels, each iteration amplifying his story. Social media posts ranged from supportive to defensive, debates flaring, opinions forming. He felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and empowerment. The exposure of his humiliation, tempered by the reach of truth. Marissa sat beside him, eyes scanning her laptop. "This is working," she said. "The narrative is shifting. People see the injustice. Dalton can't control the public perception once this spreads. He underestimated you." Jamal nodded slowly. "And the officer? He's doubling down. Reports say he's confident in his actions. It's arrogance, plain and simple. Arrogance backed by authority is dangerous," Marissa said. "But it's also fragile. Exposure cracks it. That's where justice begins." He took a deep breath. The weight of the day pressed on him. But he felt a new kind of determination, born from the public acknowledgement of what he had endured. Dalton's prejudice had sparked something larger, a conversation, a challenge to authority, and a documentation of systemic bias. Over the next few days, the story grew. Local newspapers covered it, citing eyewitness accounts and footage, describing the officer's questionable judgment. Advocacy groups released statements supporting Jamal, highlighting patterns of racial profiling and the importance of accountability. Jamal returned to museum daily, overseeing the exhibit, engaging with visitors, and speaking carefully to the media. Every interview, every public statement was measured, precise, yet infused with moral authority. He refused to let Dalton's assumptions define the narrative. One afternoon, a young visitor approached him. "Mr. Harris, thank you," she said softly. "I didn't realize history was like this. I didn't see it before." Jamal felt a swell of pride. "History is always here," he said gently. "We just have to be willing to look." The visitor smiled and walked away, leaving Jamal with a reminder. The next morning, Jamal arrived at the museum earlier than usual. The chill of winter clung to the streets outside, sharp against his skin, but inside, the warmth of the exhibit greeted him. He moved past the glass cases, the placards, and the photographs, his footsteps quiet against the polished floors. Today would be different. He could feel it. Officer Richard Dalton was waiting in the lobby, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the room like a predator calculating its next move. Jamal's stomach tightened. The officer's smirk was there, thin and cruel, but today it carried a different energy. Tension, uncertainty, the subtle shift that comes when control begins to slip. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," Dalton said, voice deceptively casual. "Quite the publicity your little incident has generated." Jamal met his gaze steadily. I'm aware of your assumptions yesterday, officer. Let's be clear. Your behavior was inappropriate, discriminatory, and documented. This isn't about you being upset. It's about accountability." Dalton's jaw tightened slightly. "Accountability? I was doing my job, keeping the museum safe. And yet, here you are, the public cheering your own version of events. People see what they want to see. They see the truth," Jamal said firmly. "The logs, the staff statements, the security footage, all of it supports my account. Your assumptions do not. A small crowd had begun to gather near the entrance, drawn by whispers and the subtle stir of media presence. Cameras from smartphones, discreet yet numerous, recorded the encounter. Dalton noticed them, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Perhaps, Dalton said, voice low, you think the public will protect you, but authority doesn't work that way. I make judgment calls. I decide what's acceptable behavior. You test boundaries. Jamal felt the weight of history in Dalton's words. Test boundaries. Speak truth. Be visible. Each phrase echoed generations of systemic bias, of assumptions about who belonged, who could speak, who could exist without scrutiny. I am not testing boundaries, Jamal said, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. I am doing my job. I am performing my duty, and I will not be judged, questioned, or humiliated for simply existing in the space I manage. Dalton stepped closer, the air between them thick with tension. You think you're untouchable because of media attention? Because a few people are watching? That doesn't change anything. Here, in my jurisdiction, I decide. I enforce. You comply, or there are consequences. Jamal squared his shoulders. Enforcing authority does not justify prejudice, and compliance does not erase responsibility. You are accountable for your actions, officer. The public is watching. Internal affairs is reviewing your behavior. Your assumptions, your bias, your abuse of power, they are all documented. And yes, people are watching. A murmur ran through the crowd. Phones rose. Cameras clicked. Dalton's confident facade began to falter. For the first time, his smirk wavered. You think this makes you righteous? Dalton demanded, voice rising. This is about order, about rules. And you make it personal. It is personal, Jamal said calmly, eyes locking with Dalton's. Because prejudice, discrimination, and abuse of authority are personal. They affect real people, real lives, every day. And you have chosen to wield your authority without accountability. That is the problem. Dalton's fists clenched at his sides. You're making accusations. Facts are not accusations, Jamal replied firmly. They are facts. And the facts show that you acted on assumptions, targeted me without cause, and dismissed evidence that contradicted your narrative. That is unacceptable. The crowd had grown larger. Murmurs became questions. One visitor, a young woman, called out, "Why is he harassing Curator? Isn't this his museum?" Another voice echoed, "The footage proves he's telling the truth." Dalton's composure cracked. His authority, once absolute in the sterile confines of the office, was now challenged by visibility and evidence. The subtle power of unchecked assumptions was slipping. "You think this is over?" Dalton hissed. "I still have the badge. I still have authority." "Authority without accountability is empty," Jamal said softly, deliberately. "And authority abused in public will eventually crumble under scrutiny. The badge doesn't protect you from the truth, and the people will see that." A phone camera clicked sharply. Dalton's eyes darted around, realizing the public was recording every movement, every gesture. Each smirk, each word, each subtle intimidation tactic was now part of the permanent record. "Enough," Dalton barked, stepping back. "You think the crowd, the cameras, the statements, any of it changes reality?" "It changes accountability," Jamal said calmly, voice resonant. "It changes consequences. It changes history. And it changes you, because no one is above scrutiny. No one is beyond responsibility. Not even you." For a moment, Dalton's eyes flickered, frustration, disbelief, even fear. He glanced at the smartphones, the murmuring crowd, the staff witnessing the confrontation. His control, once absolute, was eroding under the weight of truth. You'll regret this," Dalton spat. "No," Jamal said, voice quiet but firm. "I will not. Justice is not revenge. It is accountability. And the world sees what you cannot hide. That is your reality now." The tension lingered for a moment longer. Dalton's fists relaxed slightly. His shoulders slumped imperceptibly. The power he wielded so casually in offices and corridors seemed diminished under the scrutiny of witnesses, cameras, and the undeniable record of his actions. Jamal's gaze remained steady. "You have a choice," he said. "You can acknowledge your mistakes, take responsibility, and begin to." The following morning, Jamal returned to the museum with a sense of grim determination. News coverage of the previous day's confrontation had spread citywide, and whispers of the incident were circulating even beyond the walls of the museum. Staff and visitors greeted him with subtle nods, some quietly expressing support. Others wary of being associated with the growing controversy. Jamal ignored the whispers, focusing on the work ahead. Marissa Lane arrived with her briefcase in hand, her eyes sharp, her presence commanding. "We need to push this forward," she said, voice firm. "Internal Affairs is reviewing Dalton's actions, but public exposure accelerates accountability. The evidence is clear, his bias, his misuse of authority, but we need pressure to ensure consequences." Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility press upon him. The exhibit had always been a testament to systemic injustice, but now he was living that narrative. His own experience had become part of the story, a new exhibit within the broader history of racism. They began compiling every piece of evidence: security footage, staff statements, visitor logs, timestamps, and the documentation of Dalton's biased remarks. Each item was meticulously organized, cross-referenced, and annotated. Marissa dictated notes, Jamal recorded observations, and together they created an airtight dossier. "This is solid," Marissa said, reviewing a folder filled with screenshots and transcribed dialogue. "Every action, every assumption, every dismissal is documented. If Internal Affairs ignores this, the public won't. The narrative is in your favor, Jamal." Jamal exhaled slowly. "I never imagined my work curating the history of racism would intersect so directly with lived experience. But here we are. It's one thing to document injustice. It's another to endure it personally and still demand accountability." Marissa gave a small, approving nod. "That's precisely why your testimony matters. You're not just a witness to history. You are part of it now. And history has a way of catching up with those who abuse power." By mid-afternoon, the dossier was ready. Marissa submitted it to Internal Affairs, along with a cover letter detailing Dalton's misconduct and bias. Jamal observed the process with careful attention, aware that the investigation was now formalized. "I want transparency," Marissa said, her tone resolute. "We'll request updates, follow every procedure, and ensure that Dalton's actions are scrutinized. Nothing escapes documentation." Jamal nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. The officer's arrogance had been exposed publicly, but the next step was institutional, where consequences could truly take shape. Later, as the museum emptied, Jamal wandered to the exhibit hall alone. He paused before a display highlighting civil rights activism in the 1960s. Photographs of protests, sit-ins, and marches stared back at him, each image carrying the weight of struggle and resilience. He realized that his current battle was a continuation of the same fight, against bias, systemic oppression, and the assumption that authority can act without accountability. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. Marissa had sent him a text. Public response is growing. Social media engagement is high. News outlets are following up. Dalton can't hide now. The morning sunlight streamed through museum windows, casting long patterns across the polished floors. Jamal Harris stood at the entrance to the exhibit hall, waiting for the meeting that would mark the beginning of formal accountability. Today, Internal Affairs representatives, museum administrators, and legal counsel would convene to address Officer Dalton's conduct. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of anticipation, vigilance, and cautious optimism. Marissa Lane arrived early, briefcase in hand, eyes sharp and focused. "Today is about clarity, documentation, and ensuring the facts are undeniable," she said. "Dalton's bias has been exposed publicly, and the evidence is meticulous. He will not escape scrutiny." Jamal nodded, feeling a tight knot of anxiety and resolve. He had prepared for this moment for days, compiling records, statements, and footage that captured every detail of Dalton's misconduct. But as he stepped into the meeting room, the weight of confrontation settled upon him once again. The room was sterile, large, and lined with chairs for the various parties. At the head of the table sat two Internal Affairs investigators, their expressions unreadable but attentive. Dalton was present as well, posture rigid, eyes flicking between Jamal, Marissa, and the investigators. His smirk was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of composure that barely concealed the tension beneath. "Mr. Harris," the lead investigator began, voice calm, "we've reviewed your formal complaint, the accompanying evidence, and public reports of the incident. Please recount the events from your perspective." Jamal took a deep breath, his eyes steady. "On the morning of December 15th, I arrived at the museum to oversee my History of Racism exhibit. Officer Dalton approached me in the lobby, made assumptions about my behavior and identity, and demanded I provide a statement without verification of my role as curator. Security footage, visitor logs, and staff statements confirm my identity and the legitimacy of my actions. Despite this, he continued to question me, citing suspicious behavior and my race as justification for scrutiny." Dalton shifted in his seat, a subtle flicker of irritation crossing his face. Marissa interjected, voice firm and precise. The officer's actions were not isolated. They reflect systemic bias, targeting Mr. Harris based on assumptions rather than facts. We have compiled comprehensive evidence demonstrating both the procedural failures and the racial prejudice that informed his conduct. The investigators nodded, taking notes. Dalton's lawyer cleared his throat, a quiet attempt to interject. "My client acted within the bounds of authority. Any perceptions of bias are purely subjective." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he maintained composure. "Authority does not absolve prejudice. Compliance with procedure is not a shield for discrimination. Every action is documented, and every assumption he made was influenced by bias. This is not subjective. It is evidenced by multiple sources." One investigator leaned forward. "We will consider all submitted evidence. Dalton, you will have the opportunity to respond to these claims. However, we must emphasize the gravity of allegations involving racial bias and abuse of authority." Dalton's eyes flickered toward Jamal, and for a moment, his usual arrogance wavered. The power he once wielded freely now carried the burden of scrutiny. Dalton spoke slowly, measured. "I acted based on observations. At the time, I believed my actions were justified. Any perception of bias was unintentional. I followed procedure as I understood it." Jamal met his gaze, unwavering. "Intent does not erase impact. Your actions were discriminatory, and they caused real harm, public humiliation, emotional distress, and the undermining of institutional trust. Procedure without accountability is meaningless." The room fell into tense silence. The investigators exchanged glances, clearly weighing the evidence against Dalton's defense. Marissa leaned subtly toward Jamal, offering a quiet nod of reassurance. "Your actions," the lead investigator said finally, "have been documented, analyzed, and corroborated by multiple sources. Internal Affairs will pursue disciplinary measures, including review of duty status, training requirements, and formal reprimands. The officer's behavior does not align with the standards of conduct expected of law enforcement." The city's evening skyline glimmered through museum windows, a constellation of lights reflecting on the polished floors. Jamal Harris walked slowly through the exhibit hall, the quiet hum of visitors a stark contrast to the turmoil of the past weeks. Each photograph, each placard, each display of history now carried a new weight, not just as documentation of the past, but as evidence of lived experience and the ongoing fight for justice. He paused in front of the large central exhibit, a collage of protests, sit-ins, and community activism. Faces frozen in time stared back at him, defiant, proud, unbowed. Jamal traced the edge of one photograph with his finger, feeling the connection between their struggle and his own. The fight he'd endured against Dalton, though different in form, echoed the resistance captured in these images. Marissa Lane joined him silently, her presence steady and reassuring. "It's done," she said softly. "Internal Affairs has completed their review. Dalton has received formal reprimands, mandatory training, and his actions are now part of the official record. Public awareness has ensured accountability." Jamal nodded, a mix of relief and lingering tension in his chest. "It's surreal," he murmured, "to go from being questioned, humiliated, and doubted to seeing actual justice take shape. I never thought standing up would feel this heavy, but necessary." Marissa's eyes softened. Resistance always carries weight, but it also carries meaning. You've set a precedent, proof that authority is not untouchable, that bias has consequences, and that visibility matters. He walked slowly through the hall, observing visitors engage with the exhibits, reading, reflecting, asking questions. Each interaction was a reminder that history is living, and the fight against injustice is ongoing. Jamal realized that this story, his story, was now part of the narrative, a lesson in accountability, perseverance, and courage. A young visitor approached, holding a notebook. "Mr. Harris," she said softly. "Thank you. I didn't realize how often people assume things about others. Seeing you stand up, it's powerful." Jamal smiled gently. Awareness is a first step. Action is the next. And it's not always easy, but it's always worth it. History is filled with examples of people who refuse to stay silent. You're learning from that legacy. The visitor nodded, inspired, and moved on to the next display. Jamal felt a quiet satisfaction, the recognition that the impact of his resistance extended beyond immediate events. It was shaping minds, influencing perspectives, and fostering understanding. Later, Jamal sat in his office, reviewing the documentation and media coverage one last time. The evidence of Dalton's misconduct, combined with public scrutiny and institutional investigation, had created an undeniable record. The officer's arrogance had been checked, but Jamal understood that true change required continued vigilance. Bias, assumptions, and prejudice are persistent forces. They cannot be eradicated by a single victory. The city's morning air was crisp, carrying a sense of quiet anticipation. Jamal Harris walked toward the museum with purpose, the weight of the past weeks balanced by a steady determination. Today was different. Not just another day of curation, not another press interview, but a moment that would solidify the culmination of months of struggle, confrontation, and exposure. The museum lobby was filled with staff, visitors, and several members of the press. Cameras clicked softly in the background, capturing the scene, while reporters murmured quietly to one another. Jamal's presence commanded attention, not through arrogance, but through the quiet authority of someone who had endured, documented, and persisted in the pursuit of justice. Marissa Lane approached, her expression both proud and resolute. "Today is about closure and reflection," she said. "Dalton has been formally reprimanded. The public is informed, and the museum has taken a firm stand on bias and accountability. This is a culmination of your efforts, yours and the museum's." Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle lightly on his shoulders. "Closure is rare," he said quietly, "but accountability, acknowledgement, and education, that's real progress." The press conference began promptly. Jamal stood at the podium, the microphone adjusted to his height. Behind him, the museum's logo gleamed on a large banner. The room was silent, expectant. Cameras focused, lights bright, as Jamal adjusted his glasses and began to speak. "Good morning," he began, voice steady, resonant, and authoritative. "I stand before you not just as a curator of the History of Racism exhibit, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the challenges of bias and assumptions in professional spaces. The recent incident involving Officer Richard Dalton highlighted the importance of accountability, documentation, and visibility. Prejudice, when left unchecked, affects real lives. It undermines trust, erodes institutions, and perpetuates injustice." The room was silent except for the scribbling of notes and the soft hum of cameras. Jamal continued, describing the incident factually, focusing on evidence, public awareness, and institutional response. He avoided sensationalism, instead emphasizing moral clarity and systemic patterns. Officer Dalton's actions were documented, reviewed, and addressed through formal channels. Jamal said, "Internal Affairs has issued reprimands, mandated training, and confirmed that his conduct violated standards of professional behavior. But beyond individual consequences, this incident serves as a reminder that authority without accountability is dangerous, and that visibility, persistence, and truth are essential in combating systemic bias." A reporter raised a hand. "Mr. Harris, what do you hope the public takes from this incident?" Jamal paused, considering the weight of his answer. "I hope the public recognizes that injustice is not always overt, and that assumptions, when unchecked, can have profound effects. I hope they understand the power of documentation, testimony, and persistence. And I hope they see that confronting bias is not an act of vengeance, but a moral responsibility.